We are the paradoxical ape. Bipedal, naked, large-brained, long the master of fire, tools, and language, but still trying to understand ourselves. Aware that death is inevitable, yet filled with optimism. We grow up slowly. We hand down knowledge. We empathize and deceive. We shape the future from our shared understanding of the past. CARTA brings together experts from diverse disciplines to exchange insights on who we are and how we got here. An exploration made possible by the generosity of humans like you.
Dobzhansky said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. However, as John Coffin said, although no biological explanation makes sense except in the light of evolution, it does not follow that all evolutionary explanations make sense. So take everything you heard today, including what I said, with a grain of salt. Another important point when it comes to humans is Dobzhansky himself said, human evolution cannot be understood as a purely biological process, nor can it be adequately described as a history of culture. It is the interaction of biology and culture, what we would now call gene-culture coevolution, and there exists a feedback between the biological and cultural processes. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about humans as part of biology. And Nico Thunberg suggested that for any biological entity, you should ask, how does it function? How did it evolve? How did the entity develop? How does it develop during your lifetime? And what are the proximate causes that regulate its behavior? So we can ask the same questions about non-human and non-human awareness of death and understanding of personal mortality. And because of lack of time, I'm not going to give you my opinions on it, and just think about these questions and whether they have been answered today. And the CARTA questions are humans unusual in aspects of these features? I think we are. The question is, there's a lot more we need to learn. When did these unusual aspects appear in human evolution? Again, we left a lot of questions unanswered. And finally, what is the impact on the current human condition? At CARTA, we tend to focus on the origins of humans and where we came from, and tend to not spend a lot of time about how it impacts us directly. But obviously, we're very interested in that. And I'd like to point out that Ingrid Benishka-Perkins has been in contact with several organizations relevant to death awareness and mortality. Here's a list of academic and research organizations, as well as general and public outreach organizations. And these are all very active groups, and some of them are actually represented here today who have spread the word about this symposium. So I encourage you to get involved in this, because I think we all need to not only face this problem, but also talk about it freely, both from the evolutionary perspective as well as the practical perspective. So with that, I'm going to start up the question and answer session, and Nick's going to lead the first session. I need to get questions from the second session, if there are any. I've got to we'll go through them. So Nick's up next, I think.
How do children of atheists get to know, what do they learn about death? And it's obviously a rather difficult issue to research in the United States, because there aren't enough of them, but around the world, there are, of course, parents who do not believe in the afterlife or any religious interpretation. And has any study been done of those sorts of families, and whether they, in any, even possibly, actually invent the afterlife for themselves? Paul.
Well, I'm afraid the short answer to that particular interesting question is that we don't know. The research has not been conducted, although it would be fair to say, of course, that any child growing up with an atheistic family, certainly in the United States, or Western Europe or Scandinavia, where atheism is more frequent, may not be exposed exclusively to atheistic assumptions about the nature of death. They will hear other voices. And so a more complex answer to the question is, how do children sift these various competing voices which they're likely to hear? Just one other point, which is that, of course, there are places, particularly contemporary China, where the dominant view, at least, there's no institutionally or government-sanctioned afterlife beliefs. And so research there would be obviously worthwhile conducting.
Okay. Question for either Dr. Biro or Dr. Maslow. Let's give it to Dr. Maslow. What do we know about the reaction of a dog to the death of its human caregiver or owner? And of course, we're all familiar, I'm sure, with stories about Greyfriars Bobby and so on. Do you want to pass it to Dora? Dora, you come up and answer it too.
Dora might have a better answer.
Sorry, I think I spoke to the lady who asked this question during the break, but there are some very interesting anecdotal stories about dogs essentially mourning the death of their owners. I'm currently on sabbatical in Japan, and Japan has one of these very, very famous stories. Many of you will probably know. A dog owner who used to take his dog to the train station every day for, I can't remember how many years, and would leave him there, go off to work, and then come back in the evening. And the dog would be there at the station waiting for him every single day. And when the owner passed away, without the dog's knowledge, I guess, in the sense that the dog wasn't there when the owner died, the dog continued to turn up at the train station daily for, I think, 19 years or something like that. There is now a statue to this dog at that train station in Tokyo. So I think, anecdotally at least, we've got some extremely striking cases of dogs with very, very strong bonds to their human owners, kind of keeping those strong bonds going even beyond death.
Okay, Jack, another one for you. The questioner says that in London she saw crows attacking and killing another crow. Can you comment on that and how they could at the same time be fascinated by the death of an animal but also bring it apart?
There have been lots of documentations of crows killing other crows and ravens killing ravens, and there might be several motivations for that. Some of them are just involved with territorial excursion, going in the wrong territory and being attacked, and once a victim is basically helpless, others pile in on that and kill that animal. It's pretty routine. I had seen it myself when a bird was hit by a car and it was wounded and fluttering around, and other crows killed that individual. So these sorts of things happen. They might be somewhat misdirected behavior in that case. But there is a very interesting study from Austria where ravens were socially punishing each other for kind of social transgressions, and they would break the other raven's wing in that respect. So they didn't kill it, but they functionally killed it, rendering it unable to fly. So that one was harder to explain as kind of a misdirected bit of behavior.
Another question for Paul. Dora Biro discussed whether or not it's a good idea to let animals in zoos be exposed to the death of their cellmates, zoo mates. Does Dr. Harris think it would be a good idea for humans to be exposed to the death, directly exposed to the death of their children or family in a way, of course, which doesn't happen generally now?
Yes, I'm very reluctant to draw prescriptive conclusions from the modest research base we have, but I guess what we do know is that around the world, children vary dramatically in the extent of exposure to death. So, for example, it would be nice to hear from Rita, if I can identify her, who will tell you a little bit about the role that children are ascribed both prior to death and immediately thereafter in Madagascar.
Yeah, so if you followed the description I gave of the funerals, I didn't mention the children, but you should imagine at the gathering of, especially when the meals are happening, as people arrive at the village, newcomers tend to go into the house and they will see the deceased person for the first time, and there are these eruptions of wailing and crying, and the kids who are basically there to hang out and eat the food and play, you kind of have these moments of gathering, and they're very, I guess, attracted and scared by what is going on. So you would always see them hanging from the windows and, trying to peer into the house to witness both the kind of display of emotion, and then through that also to get, a close view of the deceased, and which is the corpse is laid in the house under a mosquito net, and it's, a very powerful kind of experience, which is paired up with a very hands-on experience of animal death. So children are playing with animals, literally playing with animals, and kind of expecting them quite inquisitively by pulling bits and sort of saying, oh, it's not moving anymore, it's dead. So there is this experience of animal death and human death, which is, much more available than it is in our societies. And then there are these very dramatic moments for some children. So if a mother or a father dies, I'm not sure about siblings, but certainly I've seen it with parents. Children are kind of, just before the coffin gets closed to be taken away to the cemetery, the children are taken and kind of forced to face the face of the deceased. They're kind of put on top of the coffin, and they're told, look, this is your mother, she's dead, never again utter her name. So there is a taboo you can refer to the mother, but you shouldn't use the name with which she was known. So there is this very dramatic kind of separation moment of face-to-face with the body of the parent. So anyway, yeah, it's a very available experience, which I think, is integrated in both. Paul hinted in his talk, suggested in his talk, that children pick up the notion that there is something that survives after death, after they have consolidated the kind of biological understanding of death, and that came through in Madagascar as well in the research we've done together. It seems that, although logically it doesn't have to be that way, but it seems that before children can understand the ancestors, these people who have arrived at the place where they are, as I describe them, they kind of have to put together the biological understanding of this dead body and what that means.
Joe, question about how facial expressions in mammals fit into your revised model of fear. I think what this could be about is that you talked about these subconscious limbic reactions, which can produce obviously flight and escape and so on, but they can also produce frightened, fearful faces. Now, that's obviously not to do with escaping from anything. What do you see as the role of facial expressions associated with fear? And yes, you, Joe. And why is it we find it so easy to read these across species? And could actually other species read them across species too?
So I think, this is a good example of the conflation that we have between innate behavioral patterns and subjective experiences. So the expression on a face is not controlled by the same system in the brain that gives rise to the subjective experience. So I think those have to be kept separate. What was the follow-up?
Whether this cross-species recognition.
Right. So well, first of all, you asked about the universality of it, but that's been questioned. I mean, if you show people these pictures and give them multiple choice answers to select from, they're more accurate than if they have to spontaneously generate it's fear, anger, or whatever. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't certain recognizable expressions around the world, because obviously there are to some extent. And again, these are innate patterns that are different from the experiences that people have. So these patterns, some of them can be obviously conserved across other primates and people, or even dogs and certain mouth movements. So there's nothing magical about that. Those are just behaviors that have been wired in because of their signal value and their ability to direct behaviors of other animals. So I think it's just important that we separate the experiences, subjective experiences, that we interpret that go with these faces, because sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Experience is not or expressions are not a 100% reliable way of judging exactly what's on someone's mind.
What do you think the function of expressing fear is? It's obviously, you don't really want your enemy to know how you're feeling, do you?
Well, I would call it expressing, responses to threats rather than fear itself. I think that's one of those just so stories. We don't know exactly why why we do this. I think it may be a signaling for conspecific. So if you're expressing some response to danger, other like kind can use that as a signal to stay away and perhaps extend their life.
Most of the matter in the universe we cannot see or characterize, and we understand so little of the origins of consciousness. Is it not, therefore, foolish to dismiss concepts we currently consider magical or religious, or in practicum, that we conclude we are. Well, I think the message is, Ajita, should you be considering some alternative kind of explanations for our reality denial and religious beliefs and so on, because actually they may not just be defense mechanisms, they may get closer to the truth of the world we live in. Where's the guy gone? There.
Well, I don't have a specific answer except to say that I just presented one possible explanation for a lot of phenomena, but you can see that today we've raised a lot more questions than answers, so I think it just bespeaks the notion that this whole area needs a lot more research, and I just keep my mind open about it.
Okay, I think we've run the gamut of these questions. Should we go to yours?
Okay. All right. So many of the questions are very personal and lengthy and be hard to deal with in a general audience. So those who had the very personal questions should probably approach the specific speaker if they have a question. So a question to Sheldon, comment on the field of neuroethology, study of the brain during religious experience, and perhaps comment on the near-death experience.
I'm not equipped on the neuroethology part of the question to weigh in. There is a body of literature that I'm vaguely aware of that shows that a particular part of one's brain lights up in the context of any religious experience broadly defined. Interesting and perhaps important, but I'm literally not sufficiently familiar or have the skills to judge. Near-death experiences are also complex and difficult. I am, in conjunction with a graduate student at the University of Padua in Italy, Simone Bianco. We're studying people that have had near-death experiences, and we're thinking about them as natural phenomenon, which just means we're agnostic with regard to what's actually happening. And our interest is just the psychological consequences of having had those experiences. So we're trying to assemble a large enough group of people around the world who have had near-death experiences, and we're comparing them with a matched control group of folks who have not, to see what happens in our experiments when they're subliminally primed to be reminded of their mortality. If you ask folks that have had near-death experiences to comment on what has happened to them thereafter, they fairly consistently say that these are transformative experiences and that for the most part, they're no longer afraid of dying. And I'll get back to you. If we get to come back again in a year or two, I'll let you know. Or please do write me if anybody's interested, and I'll let you know the outcome of that research.
One more question.
Sure.
So another question to Sheldon. If increased awareness of inevitability of death and our mortality exacerbate individual and societal maladaptive behaviors, how do we move towards an acceptance of death?
To be silly at the end of a long day, if I could answer that question, I would be chugging rum out of a coconut with my Nobel Prize on the beach someplace. But what I would say, these are great questions. So what I would say, and I do believe this is important, we need to distinguish between the relatively fleeting reminders of death that we use in our studies. So, somebody standing in front of a funeral parlor, somebody where we blast the word death subliminally, and they're not even aware that that has happened. That's very different than the sustained and very conscious contemplation of one's mortality that a lot of religious and philosophical traditions are advising. So, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the medieval monks that work with a skull on their desks, or anybody who's had enough free time and read Heidegger's Being and Time. It's taken me a lifetime, but that's surely more than fleeting. And I suspect, and I think this gets back to something that Nick said at the end of his talk, and some of the other folks have also, and that's culture matters as a grotesque overgeneralization. We in the West live in a culture where we go to great lengths to kind of bury death anxiety. And it's not death anxiety per se, we would argue, that produces pernicious outcomes. It's when we, psychologically speaking, try and banish it and bury it underneath the psychological bushes that it comes back to bear malignant fruit. And so, and Ajit had a list of organizations up on the screen, and many of them, such as the Death Cafe, I think are well-intentioned efforts to provide very public spaces so that people generally in a secular society can start to have open and candid conversations, and I think that would be a good start.
Okay, so related to that, to Colin Renfrew, if Western society were to continue on a more secular path, rejecting the concept of an afterlife and the immortality of the soul, could we expect a decline in death and mourning rituals?
I think not necessarily so. Ritual is something which doesn't necessarily depend, or I suppose it always depends to some extent on a worldview, but it doesn't depend on a worldview which involves belief in a deity or a divinity or in an afterlife. And I think it's the case, as indeed we've seen, we've talked of these early burials in the Upper Paleolithic period, which were clearly seriously undertaken and very carefully undertaken. And at that time, of course, it's very difficult to talk about the development of religion in prehistoric times when we don't have written texts. And in those very very early times, we don't have any way of denying that there may have been religious beliefs, but we certainly don't have any iconography that would promote a notion that there was a specific divinity. It would be too long an aside to go on to talk about what I think are probably the erroneous ideas of a great Earth Mother in Upper Paleolithic times. But clearly, as we've heard so well documented, death does engender regret in those living, mourning in those that remain. And though we've heard very interesting narratives about how the ceremonies of mourning are not always focused on regret of the passing of the deceased person, but have a very active life in the remaining community, I think it's appropriate, and I think for an agnostic person, it is appropriate to note the passing of a deceased person, a friend or someone who is much admired. So I think the commemoration of the dead does not need to be based on any sincere or sophisticated religious belief systems. So I don't know if that answers that. Anyway, a brief answer.
Thank you. Okay, question for Nick. Could we not equally consider suicide as a positive selection mechanism against diseases of evolution and disadvantageous states of mind? In other words, could suicide have been selected for rather than a failure to select against?
I think you could make a case that some suicides, if they were undertaken with that kind of motive, not only do occur, but would have actually, could have even been selected for, to take yourself out of society when you're sick or a burden on others, would actually end up increasing the kind of eugenic mechanism of a sort. There's no evidence that animals do anything like that, which suggests that we're not likely to find it in humans unless it's a highly rationalized intellectual response. But we do know plenty of examples, interesting enough, of altruistic suicide rather like that, where the wonderful example, I wish I'd had time to show the pictures of it to you. There's a village in Eyam in Derbyshire in England, which in 1666, when the Great Plague struck, it arrived in this village through some fleas on a bale of cloth which had been delivered there, and the villagers realized immediately the danger they were in. Their response wasn't to leave, it was to quarantine the village. They basically made the decision, no one will leave, no one will come in, and food and things were passed across through a kind of barrier which didn't allow any spread of the disease. And in that village, of the 600 people originally there, 400 died. But by doing that, they very likely saved an awful lot of lives of others outside. Of course, unrelated others. This is a very high level of selection. If something like that could be seen to be beneficial to human genome. But I think, yes, the answer is that there are possibilities that removing yourself could have positive effects. But I don't think you can make any case like that for by far the majority of suicides, which, as I said, seem to be largely self-interested, though maybe I think that's a hard word to use about them. They are self-euthanasia. People are trying to mend their own inner life, their inner world.
One more for you. So it's an appropriate follow-up. Could not egoistic suicide be selected for, since it would remove from the gene pool young people suffering from mental illness such as depression prior to reproduction, increase suicide in young depressed people who have a more realistic grasp of studies showed that non-depressed people have a more optimistic view of reality. and whereas depressed people actually have better grasp of reality, in other words, the so-called depressive realism. I almost could have written that question myself. I didn't.
Yes, well, firstly on this issue of mental illness, it's hugely exaggerated the extent to which suicide is related to mental illness. It's commonly said in the West that 90% of suicides have got major depressive illness. This is based on so-called psychological autopsies. When you ask after someone's died, you ask their friends and their family and so on, what signs of it did you see? It's, of course, the evidence you get back from that is going to be hugely biased. Once somebody's killed themselves, in retrospect, of course, you can find all sorts of reasons why you might have thought it was going to happen. But my more important point is that those statistics of 90% are only for Europe and America. Go across the rest of the world, India, China, or whatever, and you find the rates of illness associated with, of mental illness associated with suicide way, way down. And by far the majority, there's a big review in Science recently, have no identifiable psychiatric mental illness. Among the Palawan, the people in Palawan, I mentioned Charles MacDonald's study of there's this area of villages which have very high suicide rates. They've recently done a further study in which they did psychological autopsies on them. They found that there was almost no noticeable evidence of mental illness. There was the one or two agoraphobia was apparently present in some of them, but no major issue which would have been wise to remove from the population by letting these people kill themselves. I think that's a wrong way to think about it. Though, of course, if you think in eugenic terms, we're going to, of course, always ask whether it would have been better for the species if these people hadn't lived. But I think in the particular cases, there are cases where people who are seriously malformed or ill can volunteer not to reproduce, for example, which is a kind of suicide. That's not always a free decision which they make, but certainly in some cases there are people who won't reproduce because they know that they'd be passing on faulty genes to their children. And that's a bit like what you're just talking about. That is a way in which, not exactly suicide, but denial of your contribution to the next generation could actually benefit the human genome.
Thank you. Just putting on my medical hat, I would suggest that we not exactly agree on this. I would suggest that in all societies there's a baseline rate of suicide that's associated with major depressive disorder, which is greatly upticked when there are activities of various kinds going on. So actually, we're coming close to the end. So the final question that somebody asked, which is a good one, is to each of the speakers. What is the next big question that the upcoming generation of researchers should seek to answer in our study of death? We just have enough time for each one of you to come and give one.
I've just been speaking, so someone else first.
Yeah, somebody come forward. If you could wave a magic wand and have as much money as you want, which experiment would you do or research would you?
Well, I need a glass of wine before I come up with an experiment, but I do think what these series of talks have illustrated for me is that there's a sort of, not a schism, it's too strong a word, but some of us have talked quite a lot about the awareness of one's own personal mortality and the terror or whatever that evokes. Others of us, on the other hand, have thought about death with respect to loved ones, those that we lose, and how we cope with their status within the broader social fabric. And so it does seem to me that we researchers, investigators, might have a longer conversation about the extent to which those two lines of investigation should be brought together, or whether one is much more important than the other. But in the course of the day, or the afternoon, I should say, we did seem to be talking to some extent about distinct themes. Yep.
Anyone else with a paradigm for the future?
I'll offer a quick note. I think that animals are much more aware of death than some people think, and getting at that better to understand the connection. I think the gradient between how humans view it and how animals view it, there's a lot more that can be done there.
I'd just like to say how much more we have to learn about beliefs in life and in death, specifically in early times, in prehistoric times, and how rich the data is, and how important it is that the archaeological data is treated properly, that is to say, is excavated in a way which reveals its context, so that we learn something more about the beliefs of past world systems, and how easily this is destroyed by either unscrupulous or careless developments, but in particular by collectors who pay good money to have artworks from the past which are ripped from their archaeological context, and all information is thereby lost. And the record of the past is a diminishing record, and it's diminished in a very negative way if people, private collectors or indeed museums, pay money essentially in order to have objects displayed in their museum without proper context. They are in fact destroying our hope of understanding the world's archaeological heritage. Thank you.
Okay, if not, I think I'll hand over to Pascal Gagnon, our Associate Director, who has some closing remarks.
So I'd like to thank all of you, especially the speakers, for an amazing lineup of talks, and the audience, those here, those online across the city and across the world. It's very hard not to be touched by this topic. And please remember that while alive, you can be kind. That stops at some point. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.